I do, although I'm using alienation not in the kind of metaphysical sense, but in a very simple sense that technologies alienate us in different ways from ourselves. So if you put on a pair of shoes, you protect your feet from the ground, but you lose touch with the ground. Similarly, if you get into a car to drive, instead of walking somewhere, you get there faster, but you lose some of the joy and some of the connection to the natural world. And I think that happens with every technology, but I think it happens in some ways the most extreme and the most personal and the most intimate ways with media and other technologies that we use to think with. And we saw that with certainly the book and the clock and the map, and I think we're seeing it again with the internet and other digital technologies. On the one hand, they give us, enormous convenience. They give us access to far more information than we ever had access to before. But on the other hand, like other technologies of that sort, they emphasize a certain mode of thought and de-emphasize another mode of thought. And I think what the net and related technologies are doing are emphasizing the side of our mind that wants to skim and scan and browse and jump around and gather as much information as possible, a very kind of primitive side of our mind in a way. But what it's de-emphasizing is a very different mode of thought, slower, quieter, more solitary, the mode of thought that underpins contemplation, introspection, reflection, deep reading. And I believe we're seeing on a personal level and on a societal level a shift away from those modes of thought to this ever faster, ever more superficial, in my view, but also a mode of thought that has other attractions and is very seductive. My fear is that as we lose our capacity for the more contemplative modes of thought, we're going to lose something very important to us as individuals, but also one of the underpinnings of culture in general.
The subtitle, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, is both metaphorical and real, right? You write about how the adoption of certain technologies over time has demonstrably changed the sizes of different parts of our brains. The hippocampus, I think, is
yeah.
one. So what do you think the internet is physically doing to brains right now?
Well, what neuroscientists have discovered in the last few decades is that the human brain, even the adult human brain, is very adaptable. It's very malleable. When we get into some habit of thinking or action, those habits are encoded, in a sense, in our brain through the strengthening of certain neural pathways and even the growth of new neurons and new synapses. And on the other hand, when we stop performing some way of thinking or some way of behavior, we begin to lose our ability, our capacity for that kind of activity. And not only lose it at a superficial level, but kind of the actual brain circuits that support it begin to weaken and in some cases fall apart. And so what I think the net is doing not only as a matter of culture and a matter of habit, but really down deep in the cellular level of the brain, is strengthening those neural functions and neural pathways that support our ability to follow lots of stimuli at once, like we do when we're online or playing video games or surfing the web in general, and making us better at that, giving us greater facility to keep track of a lot of incoming input simultaneously. But what we're losing, and again at a cellular level, is the ability to pay attention. Paying attention is not a natural state of the brain. You have to train yourself to focus on one thing because your brain kind of wants to be scatterbrained and keep track of a lot of things. And so if we don't practice paying attention to one thing, that ability goes away, and I think goes away quite quickly.
Jack, you write at some length about distraction, and in thinking about some of the pieces of that, it has had an impact not just on the brain. You write extensively about neuroscience. You spend a couple of years studying neuroscience in order to try to make connections between how we absorb news and information and the way that it's transmitted by journalists. In a way, sometimes I feel your book is as much addressing what is our brain doing with the internet as much what is the internet is doing with our brains.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. The part of the there are many ways you can look at the question. I look at what is unchanging and not particularly plastic about our brains, and I really was looking at how the changed environment that fundamental part of our brain is living in is affected by how the change affects it. To me, our minds are actually a limited resource. Whatever your eighth grade teacher taught you about only using 10% of your brain, which may have been true of some eighth graders, but generally is not true. You use it all in some way or another. It's a finite resource, and there are structural aspects of your brain that allocate that resource. And the principal one is the one that allocates attention, which is what we're talking about here, is emotion. And the more distraction and stimulus you provide people, the more vulnerable they get to emotional appeals. And I think that's what was fascinating to me as I contemplated the change in the way people are responding to news and the presentation of news. I couldn't understand. The question I asked myself is, so why are people moving away from disciplined journalism, the kind that we learned and we tried to practice, and moving toward highly emotional presentation, undisciplined by our lights? And the answer I got was that the environment had changed and the way people's brains are responding are changing.
And yet at the same time, in reading Tom's book at the same time, and there's plenty of discussion of distraction and multiple stimuli in both Jack's book and Nick's, yet there's a very real and huge part of yours that's hardly about distraction. Instead, it's I would use it's enthrallment in the literal sense of the word thrall, when you find yourself for 80 hours playing a particular game, or ignoring the results of the presidential election because you're particularly consumed by your virtual life. Why do you think you're not distracted when you enter those worlds the way that...
I'm sorry, what? I wasn't listening. This actually, I think I have an interesting place on this panel in that I think I may have been cast here as the technology-loving younger person who is going to say everything's great, but I actually don't think that at all. And I've actually seen Nick's thesis is actually played out in my own life in the last couple of years where I've been playing a lot of games. I find it harder to concentrate on reading now. I find it harder to write the dense prose for which I've become so well known. And I find it, that was a joke, by the way, and he
has a Guggenheim. He is well known.
And so Nick's thesis really, strikes a very powerful chord in my very being, and I recognize its truth in just how I've just sort of become. At the same time, all of my interests in video games and video gaming, this is going to sound kind of crazy, but they're all very old-fashioned. I'm interested in the kind of Aristotelian questions of story and narrative and what that happens when you transpose this into a medium in which the kind of authoritarian, author-directed sets of meaning and dramatic imposition, where all of that gets mixed up and you give the audience like a considerable measure of influence in that process, what that does to narrative, how it screws it up, what that means for storytelling in general. And so my interest in the medium has almost nothing to do with technology qua technology.